Hello, and welcome to the College of Natural Health Sciences Bermuda, week number 2 of the Induction Prep course. Today, we will be taking a look at the functional anatomy of the Christy Kale textbook, and we hope that this course will awaken your passion to the human body. In Chapter 1, this will be our first introduction to the human body. But before we begin, did you know that there are over 10 trillion cells in the human body? Over 15 million red blood cells are produced at any given moment. There are 206 bones in the human body and over 600 muscles in the human body. The learning objectives for today's lecture: label the regions of your human body on a diagram. You'll be able to draw the anatomical position and explain its importance in understanding human movement. We will use appropriate directional terms when describing locations of anatomical features of the human body. We will identify the 3 planes of movement and their corresponding axes and demonstrate movements possible for each. We will identify the main structures of the human body involved in human movement and strategies for locating and palpating each. We will describe the functions of various special structures in the body, including the skin, blood vessels, lymphatics, nerves, cartilage, and bursae. When we describe regions of the human body, it is first important to recognize that the anatomical position is our starting point. So whenever we make a reference to the human body, we make reference from it from the standpoint that the body is in the anatomical position. The anatomical position is when the person is standing upright with feet firmly planted on the floor, the palms are facing forward, the head and neck is looking straight on. And we can see in the diagram here what that looks like from the front view or the anterior view, and what it looks like from the posterior view. Using the anatomical position as our starting point, we can describe relative positions of different body structures using what is referred to as directional terms. There are at least 10 directional terms used to describe the anatomical regions and body positions. These 10 directional terms are superior, meaning in the head region, also referred to as cephalic; the inferior, meaning in the lower region, also referred to as caudal; anterior, meaning in the front portion, and sometimes you'll hear the term ventral being referred to anything that is in the front region of the body; posterior, anything that is in the back region of the body; and then we have proximal and distal. Proximal refers to the closest point of the body, and distal refers to the furthest point away from the body. Lateral refers to away from the midpoint of the body, and medial refers to the closest point to the middle of the body. And we can see that when we use terms such as proximal and distal, we're talking about things in the vertical plane, whereas when we use terms such as lateral and medial, we're talking about things in the horizontal plane. And we'll talk a little bit more about the planes in just a moment. Now that the anatomical position and appropriate directional terminology have been established, we are now ready to explore the language of human movement. The human body moves in complex ways, which can make description very difficult. Scientists have categorized and simplified the terminology of human movement in an effort to heighten understanding and communication. This strategy encourages consistent description and analysis of complex human movements by breaking them down into simpler parts. Motions occur at the joints of the body in one of 3 general directions: front to back, side to side, or rotationally. To describe these movements precisely, it helps to visualize the body transected by one of three large imaginary planes. The first plane, which divides the body vertically into right and left halves, is called the sagittal plane. Front to back movements occur parallel to this imaginary plane. So therefore, swinging your arms and legs back and forth with walking are examples of sagittal movements. The second plane divides the body into front and back halves. It is called the frontal or coronal plane. Side-to-side movements occur parallel to this imaginary plane. The upper and lower limb movements that occur when you do jumping jacks are examples of frontal movements. The third plane divides the body into superior and inferior regions. It is called the transverse plane or axial plane. Rotational or turning movements occur parallel to this imaginary plane. Turning your lower limb out or your head to look over your shoulder are examples of transverse movements. The word transverse means across, so a transverse view of the body is sometimes referred to as a cross section. So now let's consider the axes of movement. Each of the three types of movement, sagittal, which is front to back, frontal, which is side to side, and transverse, which is rotational, must occur around an axis, which is a pivot point. Visualize, if you will, a wheel turning on its axle. The axle is the axis that the wheel turns around. Each of the three planes of movement has a corresponding axis around which movement must occur. This axis is always perpendicular at a right angle to the corresponding plane. Understanding these imaginary axes along with their counterpart planes helps us to communicate precisely about movement. For example, the front to back movements that occur on the sagittal plane pivot around the frontal axis. This means that movements such as swinging your arms while walking front to back occur in the sagittal plane and pivot around an imaginary line that goes through the shoulder from right to left. This is also true when you bend forward at the waist. The body is moving in the sagittal plane from front to back around a frontal axis, transecting at a right angle side to side that goes through the pelvis. The side-to-side movements that occur in the frontal plane pivot around the sagittal axis. This means that the leg and arm movements during jumping jacks occur in the frontal plane and pivot around imaginary lines that go through the hips and the shoulders from the front to the back. This is also true when you tip your head to the side. This movement occurs on the frontal plane around a sagittal axis, which is transecting at a right angle front to back that goes through the cervical vertebrae of the neck. Finally, the rotational movements that occur on the transverse plane pivot around the longitudinal axis. For example, the movement of turning your head to look over your shoulder occurs in the transverse plane and pivots around an imaginary line that runs superiorly to inferiorly through the spine. Similarly, when you turn your shoulder to throw a frisbee, your arm turns on the transverse plane, which is rotation, around a longitudinal through the shoulder, transecting at a right angle up and down. So the simplest way to remember all of these things, because I know it can get quite confusing Remembering what plane and what axis is that movements in the sagittal plane pivot around the frontal axis. Movements in the frontal plane pivot around the sagittal axis, and movements in the transverse plane pivot around the longitudinal axis. Trust me, it does get better. But yes, this is the simplest way to remember how movements occur. And as time goes on, you'll get used to these terms and you'll be able to visualize them the more you go over them and the more you become familiar with them. So now let's look at joint movements. Movements that occur along each of the three planes and their corresponding axes have unique terms. Motions that occur on the sagittal plane around the frontal axis are called flexion and extension. Flexion describes movement on the sagittal plane that decreases the angle between the articulating bones, that is, the bones that contact each other to form a joint. Extension describes movement in the sagittal plane that increases the angle between articulating bones. Motions that occur on the frontal plane around a sagittal axis are called abduction and adduction. Abduction occurs when an extremity or part of an extremity, such as the hand or the foot, is moved away from the center of the midline of the body. Adduction occurs when an extremity or part of an extremity is moved toward the midline of the body. Remember, anatomical position is always the starting point when describing relative position or movement. Therefore, abducting the hand describes bending the wrist toward the thumb, and adducting describes bending the wrist toward the pinky finger. Motions that occur on the transverse plane around the longitudinal axis are simply called rotation. Rotational movements in the trunk are differentiated as right rotation and left rotation, while these same movements in the extremities are termed internal rotation and external rotation. Internal rotation describes turning motions toward the midline, and external rotation describes turning motions away from the midline of the body. These same motions are also called medial for internal and lateral or external rotation. Specialty motions exist at several locations in the human body, including the scapula, which is the shoulder blade, the shoulder, the forearm, the wrist, hip, ankle, and foot. Each of these specialty motions will be discussed in the later chapters when we look at those regions of the body. As we had mentioned earlier, anatomy is the study of an organism's structures. As you begin to explore the structures of the human body, you will discover how their unique size, shape, and other features contribute to their function or physiology. You will also discover how both form and function contribute to human movement, which is the study called kinesiology. For our purposes, we will look at the various tissues in the body, and we know that there are 4 types of tissues in the human body: epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous. Epithelial tissue covers the body's internal and external surfaces, and it is found in the outer layer of the skin, lining of the body's cavities, and within the glands. Epithelial tissue protects, absorbs, filters, and secretes substances in the body. Epithelial tissue remains in contact with external and sometimes destructive environments. but it has the capacity to regenerate, thereby replacing or repairing dead or damaged cells. There are three functional categories of epithelial tissue: surface, which is the skin; glandular, which is the sweat, tear, pituitary, thyroid, and adrenal glands; and sensory, specialized cells related to hearing, sight, smell, and taste. Connective tissue. Of the four types of tissue, connective tissue is by far the most abundant. It is found in nearly all of the structures involved in human movement. Primary movement structures such as bone, tendons, ligaments, and fascia are considered connective tissues, as are supported tissues such as cartilage, adipose, which is fat, and even blood. The components of connective tissue are as follows: extracellular matrix. This has various fibers suspended in fluid. Ground substance, which is fluid portion of the extracellular matrix. Three fiber types: collagen, reticular, and elastic. Fibroblasts, cells that secrete proteins that make up fibers in matrix. Included are osteoblasts, which is bone, and chondroblasts, which is cartilage. Macrophages, these respond to injury or infection, and fat cells. Connective tissue has specialized protein fibers and individualized cells within the connective tissue that make up the highly variable dynamic structure. That is, connective tissue changes its appearance and function by varying the amount and ratios of its component parts. Loose connective tissue has high levels of ground substance and fewer fibers. It includes adipose tissue, fat tissue, and the superficial fascia, which is a layer of loose connective tissue just below the skin. Dense connective tissue is thicker and stronger. It has more fibers and less ground substance. This includes tendons, ligaments, joint capsules, and periosteum. Fluid connective tissue contains 90% water. This includes blood and lymph. Supporting connective tissue is strong and solid. This includes bone and cartilage. Muscle tissue is a network of muscle cells that contain contractile protein structures called myofibrils. The myofibrils are stimulated by the nervous system to contract or shorten, which is what creates movement. The force generated by shortening of the myofibrils is transmitted into surrounding connective tissue called myofascia. This force is what drives internal and external human movement. Nervous tissue is a complex network of nervous cells called neurons and support cells. It has the ability to respond to a stimulus and conduct an electrical impulse. Electrical impulses travel from one neuron to another or between the neuron and other cells, such as muscle cells. These impulses serve to communicate between the nervous system and the other tissues, allowing the nervous system to monitor and regulate the body's internal and external environment. We will now explore the primary tissues involved in human movement. This includes bone, ligaments, muscle, tendon, and fascia. Bone is the fundamental structure of human movement. It provides a complex architecture to the human body and a system of levers that muscles and tendons can pull upon to create human movement. The characteristics of bone are: it is easy to palpate, and it provides bony landmarks for finding muscles, tendons, and ligaments. It is made up of collagen fibers and minerals, and it is covered with a layer of connective tissue referred to as periosteum. The function of bone is to provide a framework that supports movement of the body. It protects vulnerable structures such as the brain, spinal cord, and other organs. Bone helps to store minerals such as potassium and calcium. And bone also serves as the site for hematopoiesis, which is the formation of blood cells. Bones come in various shapes and sizes depending on the person's age, gender, and activities, as well as the function of the bone in the human body. Long bones have a distinct shaft in the middle with bumpy ends. Examples are the humerus, which is the arm bone, and the femur, which is the thigh bone. Small or short bones are often cube-shaped, and these allow for fine gliding movements. Examples are the carpals of the wrist and tarsals of the ankle. Some bones are flat and somewhat thin, like the sternum or the breastbone or the ilium, one of the pelvic bones. Irregular bones are totally unique. These include the vertebrae of the spine and the facial bones. Finally, a unique type of bone called a sesamoid bone is encased in tendon, and it helps improve the leverage and strength of muscles that cross it. The patella or kneecap is an example of a sesamoid bone. It is important to note that the forces that are placed upon bones influence their shape. Gravity and compression determine the density of bones, while tension from the pulling of tendons shapes their bumps and ridges. Familiarity with these topographical features can help you better understand the functions of bone and how they interact with other structures in the body. And when we look at arthrology in Chapter 2, we will go more into depth as to how the bones actually function and how their structure is influenced by function. So now let's consider ligaments. Ligaments are fibrous structures made of dense connective tissue that connect bones to each other. They prevent movements at joints, and they help to stabilize the joint, referred to as static stabilizers. The structure of ligaments is such that they are a complex network of collagen fibers that resist stress in multiple directions. This is referred to as the gristly field. Ligaments are present at both ends of bones, and they help to form the joints and the joint capsules. The interosseous membrane is a broad sheet of dense connective tissue that is thinner than ligaments, and it connects bone along the length of their shafts. Interosseous membranes are found in the forearm and leg and are too deep in the body to feel or to palpate. And here we have a microscopic view of ligaments that connect the bones of the body to each other. Let us now consider the three types of muscle tissue that are found in the human body. Smooth muscle tissue is found in the walls of hollow organs, vessels, and respiratory passageways. Smooth muscle is involuntary, meaning it is not something that we can consciously control. Cardiac muscle is also involuntary. It is found in the walls of the heart. It creates a pulsing action to circulate blood throughout the body. And then we have skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle is voluntary, and it produces movement by pulling on tendons and bones. Let's consider the unique features of skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle is made up of distinct bundles of parallel fibers which have a corrugated feel. skeletal fibers have distinct alignments or a fiber direction. Skeletal muscles change shape as the body moves. For example, they become long and taut when stretched, and they are thicker in the center and firmer when contracted. And here we have a microscopic view of skeletal muscle. The parallel bundles of skeletal muscle fibers helps distinguish them from other structures such as bones, tendons, and ligaments when palpated. The dense connective tissue that surrounds muscles converge to form tendons. Tendons connect muscle to bone. They contain an abundant amount of collagen fibers which provide strength and elasticity. Tendons come in a variety of shapes and sizes. Their shape changes as they stretch and contract, just like muscle. Tendons are denser and smoother than muscle. And here we have a microscopic view of a tendon. This structure attaches muscles to the bones they move. The transition point between a muscle and a tendon is felt as tissue becomes smoother and firmer. Fascia is a thin membrane of loose or dense connective tissue that covers structures of the body, such as bones, muscles, and joints. Fascia protects structures and binds them into a structural unit. It separates skin, layers of muscle, body compartments, and cavities. Fascia forms sheaths for nerves and vessels. And fascia creates continuous matrix that interconnects all structures of the body. Fascia has three main layers. The superficial layer lies directly under the dermis of the skin. It stores fat and water, and it creates passageways for nerves and vessels. Deep fascia forms convoluted network around muscles and internal structures. It aids in muscle movement, it creates passageways for nerves and vessels, and it provides muscle attachment sites which cushion the muscle. Subserous fascia separates deep fascia from membranes, and this allows movement of internal organs. And here we have a cross-sectional view of the layers of fascia. The different layers of fascia help to organize and compartmentalize the structures of the body. Superficial fascia, which is also referred to as hypodermis, lies just beneath the skin. Deep fascia separates individual muscles and muscle organs, while subserous fascia separates the organs from the abdominal cavity. We will now consider special structures of the human body. The skin is the largest organ of the human body, and it is a continuous structure that covers the entire body. It protects against the environment, it helps to regulate internal temperature, and it excretes waste products. The skin has three main layers: the epidermis, which consists of epithelial tissue, several thin layers of cells containing keratin, melanin, and defense cells; dermis, dense connective tissue which contains hair follicles, glands, nerves, blood vessels, and tiny muscles; and the hypodermis, which is loose connective tissue lying under the dermis, contains adipose cells that cushion and protect the structures. Blood vessels are also examples of special structures of the human body. Blood vessels function by way of providing a pathway for which blood can flow throughout the body. Blood vessels deliver oxygen and nutrients to body tissues, and they also remove waste. The types of blood vessels are arteries and arterioles, veins and venules, and capillaries. The lymphatic system consists of the lymphatic organs, the lymphatic vessels, and the lymphatic nodes. It functions to collect excess fluid, also known as lymph, from body tissues and return it to the circulatory system. It produces and distributes lymphocytes. This is a special feature to help the body defend itself against infection and disease. The manner of circulation is such that the lymphatic capillaries collect lymph from blood capillaries. Lymph is then transported to lymph nodes, tiny organs that cleanse it of foreign particles, viruses, and bacteria, and lymph is cleansed and drained into 1 and 2 lymphatic ducts in the chest, then into the large veins of the chest. Nerves are a part of the nervous system that controls and communicates with the rest of the body. Parts of the nervous system include the brain, the spinal cord, and the peripheral nerves. Cable-like bundles of excitable cells are called neurons. These carry electrical signals to and from the brain and spinal cord to the body in the periphery. They consist of a cell body, a nucleus, dendrites, and an axon. Types of nervous tissue include sensory nerves, which monitor internal and external environment and relay that data to the brain, and motor neurons. These carry out a response. Cartilage is a type of supporting connective tissue that varies in consistency and function by the proportion of proteins distributed throughout its matrix. Because cartilage does not contain blood vessels or nerves, it has a limited ability to heal itself following injury. The 3 types of cartilage found in the human body are elastic, which is found in the nose and ears and has the highest proportion of elastic fibers; hyaline, found in the voice box between the ribs and the sternum and the bone surfaces, is a rubbery, smooth tissue, and it helps to reduce the friction during movement; and fibrous. This is found in the disc between the vertebrae, also in the meniscus between the femur and the tibia. This cushions the joint surfaces. Our last special structure that we will consider today is bursae. Bursae are small flattened sacs containing synovial fluid. Synovial fluid is a lubricant that helps decrease the friction and create gliding movement between structures. It is found in the shoulder, the elbow, the hip, and the knee. It is fibrous, soft, and pillowy when palpated. It is difficult to palpate due to the location between the bones and large tendons. It can become enlarged and swollen when exposed to excessive friction. This is referred to as bursitis. So to recap and to summarize this lecture, precise and consistent terminology is necessary for clear communication about the human body and its movements. The anatomical position is a universal reference position useful for describing structural locations and human movement. It is described as standing upright, facing forward, with arms to the side and palms facing forward. Directional terms describe relative locations of body structures in the anatomical position. The body can be envisioned as divided by imaginary lines, sagittal, frontal, and transverse. Each plane has a corresponding axis, frontal, sagittal, and longitudinal. Body planes and axes have specific movements associated with them. These include flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, internal rotation, and external rotation. Several structures work together to make human movement possible. These include bones, muscles, tendons, ligaments, fascia, nerves, and other special structures. Various special structures nourish, regulate, or otherwise support the structure of human movement. These include blood vessels, nerves, lymphatic vessels and nodes, cartilages, and bursae. Okay, so our assignment for this week is to first name the 5 body structures that are involved in human movement. And number 2, list the 4 types of tissues that are found in the human body. Now, I don't want you to be confused by the fact that this says assignment number 1. Even though this is week 2, technically this is the first assignment because it's coming from the anatomy textbook that we were using. So this is the first chapter that we looked at. So when you submit your sheet, just put on there week number 2, assignment number 1, and I will know exactly what you mean. Also, if you are having any difficulty understanding any of the content, you are free to either email me so that we can set up a time to go over the material. My office hours are on Thursdays from 4 to 6 p.m. So you can either shoot me an email or you can send me a text 777-0589 or 703-7327, and we can set up a time during my office hours where we can go over the material. And so hopefully you'll have everything you need, and I look forward to your comments. Please leave a comment under the video here. Just give an interesting fact, something that you found interesting about today's lecture, and that will count as the forum portion assignment for this week's class. So please don't forget to do that, and I would appreciate a like, and if you haven't already subscribed to our channel, please do so that every time we upload something, you'll be notified. Okay, do take care, and I look forward to seeing your comments and receiving your assignments.